You're not even sure you want the item yet, and already your hand is moving toward the buy button because the page insists only 3 are left. Behavioral economists call this scarcity marketing, exploiting a well-documented tendency to value things more the moment they seem limited, regardless of actual demand. One shopper later discovered the 3 left counter had displayed the exact same number for over a month, never dropping, never selling out. A website that shows a low stock count without ever actually running out isn't tracking real inventory, it's manufacturing urgency to shortcut your decision-making. An app that says high demand beside a product with unremarkable sales isn't reporting data, it's borrowing the feeling of popularity to pressure a purchase. A countdown paired with limited stock isn't a coincidence, it's 2 scarcity triggers stacked deliberately for maximum urgency. This works because scarcity signals danger of missing out, and that anxiety reliably overrides careful evaluation of whether you actually want the thing. This sounds like simply honest inventory information, which some retailers do provide accurately, but real scarcity doesn't need to repeat the same suspiciously specific number for weeks. Notice if the limited stock ever actually changes when you refresh the page. Scarcity that never runs out was never real scarcity. It was a countdown, built to move you. The timer on the checkout page says the deal ends in 14 minutes, and yet somehow, when you return tomorrow, it says 14 minutes again. User experience researchers call this a fake urgency timer, a well-documented dark pattern that resets regardless of any actual deadline, designed purely to trigger fast, unexamined decisions. A sale that ends tonight but reappears identically the following week isn't a real limited-time offer. It's a permanent price with a manufactured deadline attached. A timer that resets the moment you refresh or revisit the page isn't a technical glitch. It's specifically coded to always show urgency regardless of when you actually arrive. A countdown with no clearly stated end date or time zone isn't simple simplicity in design. It's vague enough to never actually be verifiably wrong. This works because a ticking clock activates a genuine, if artificial, sense of loss, which reliably pushes people toward faster, less careful purchasing decisions. This sounds like simply a limited-time promotion, the kind legitimate sales genuinely run, but a real deadline doesn't reset itself every time you check back. Notice if the countdown ever actually reaches 0 and the deal disappears, or simply restarts. A timer that never truly expires was never really counting down. It was counting on you not noticing. The tag shows a steep, crossed-out original price beside a sale price that suddenly feels like a bargain, even though you've never actually seen the item sell at that higher number anywhere. Behavioral economists call this anchoring, using an inflated reference price to make an ordinary price feel like a deal by comparison alone. A retailer whose original price was never charged to any real customer isn't documenting a discount. It's fabricating a comparison point specifically to make the actual price feel generous. A product permanently marked as 40% off for months at a time isn't running a temporary promotion. The discounted number is simply the real, ordinary price wearing a discount's clothing. A store that raises a price temporarily right before a sale isn't adjusting for costs. It's manufacturing the exact anchor a real discount would otherwise require. This works because the brain judges prices relative to a nearby reference number, and a manipulated anchor can make almost any price feel reasonable by comparison. This sounds like simply a good deal, the kind smart shoppers look for, but real value doesn't depend on a fictional starting price to look appealing. Notice if you can find any evidence the original price was ever genuinely charged. A discount measured against a fake number was never really a discount. It was a comparison, engineered to move you. Every review reads suspiciously similar, glowing, generic, oddly enthusiastic about details that don't quite match anything specific about the actual product. Researchers studying online fraud describe this as manufactured social proof, a pattern where fake or incentivized reviews are used to simulate trust a product hasn't actually earned. A listing with hundreds of 5-star reviews posted within the same narrow time window isn't organic customer feedback. It's frequently evidence of a bulk review campaign. Reviews that repeat oddly specific, almost scripted phrases across many different supposed customers aren't a coincidence of similar taste. They're often written from the same source or template. A product with overwhelmingly positive reviews but suspiciously few 1 or 2-star ratings isn't universally excellent. Negative reviews are frequently filtered, suppressed, or simply never allowed to post. This works because review counts and star ratings function as an instant trust shortcut, one that most shoppers don't pause to verify before purchasing. This sounds like simply a popular, well-loved product, which some genuinely are, but real popularity usually leaves behind a more varied, imperfect trail of feedback. Notice how many reviews mention nearly identical phrases or arrived within the same short window of time. Reviews that all sound the same were never really independent opinions. They were copy dressed up as testimony. 3 pricing options sit side by side, and somehow the middle one, the one you were probably always going to pick, suddenly looks like the obvious, generous choice. Behavioral economists call this the decoy effect, adding a deliberately unattractive option specifically to make another option look better by comparison. A pricing page with a small option, a large option, and a middle option priced suspiciously close to the large one isn't neutral tiering. It's structured specifically to nudge you toward the higher margin choice. A subscription tier that offers barely more value for a disproportionately higher price isn't a genuine upgrade path. It's a deliberately unattractive anchor designed to make the actual target tier look reasonable. A menu, service, or product lineup with one option that seems obviously worse isn't there by oversight. It exists purely to shift your perception of the other two. This works because relative comparison is often easier and faster for the brain than evaluating absolute value, and decoys exploit that shortcut directly. This sounds like simply having a range of options to choose from, which any reasonable business offers, but real options aren't usually engineered specifically to make one look inevitable by comparison. Notice if removing the middle option would actually change which choice still looks best to you. A choice that only looks good next to a bad option was never really the best choice. It was the intended one. You scroll past an ad about a flaw you'd never really thought about, and within seconds you're suddenly, uncomfortably aware of it in a way you weren't 5 minutes ago. Marketing researchers describe this as problem creation advertising, a strategy that manufactures or amplifies an insecurity specifically so the advertised product can then resolve it. An ad that names a bodily or personal flaw you'd never previously considered a problem isn't identifying something objectively wrong. It's introducing a new standard specifically to sell the solution to it. A campaign that follows a pattern of, "You probably didn't know this about yourself," isn't offering genuine self-awareness. It's a scripted structure designed to manufacture doubt before immediately resolving it with a purchase. A product marketed as fixing a problem that didn't exist in mainstream conversation until the ad itself introduced it isn't meeting a real need. It's creating one. This works because introducing doubt about oneself is a remarkably effective way to lower resistance to whatever solution conveniently follows. This sounds like simply helpful information about self-improvement, something legitimate products do offer. But real self-improvement doesn't usually require inventing the insecurity it then claims to solve. Notice if you'd ever actually worried about this problem before the ad introduced it. An insecurity that appeared right before its solution was never really yours. It was manufactured specifically to be sold back to you. The ad doesn't sell you a benefit, it sells you a disaster, vivid and specific, that only the product being advertised can supposedly prevent. Psychologists studying persuasion describe this as fear appeal marketing, using anxiety about a negative outcome to bypass a calmer, more rational evaluation of the actual product. An ad that opens with a frightening scenario before ever mentioning the product itself isn't establishing context, it's deliberately activating anxiety before offering itself as the only visible relief. A campaign that implies a serious, even catastrophic consequence for not purchasing isn't providing safety information. It's using manufactured stakes disproportionate to the actual product's real function. A security or insurance ad that leads with worst-case imagery rather than actual statistics or coverage details isn't informing your decision, it's frightening you into skipping that evaluation altogether. This works because fear reliably narrows thinking toward immediate threat reduction, making a purchase feel urgent rather than optional, regardless of the product's actual necessity. This sounds like simply responsible safety marketing, something legitimate products in health or security genuinely need to communicate, but real safety information doesn't need to manufacture disproportionate dread to make its case. Notice if the fear in the ad matches the actual statistical likelihood of the outcome it's warning you about. An ad that frightens before it informs was never really protecting you. It was recruiting your fear to make the sale. Signing up took 30 seconds, cheerful and frictionless, but the cancellation process, when you finally look for it, seems to have been designed by an entirely different, much less helpful company. User experience researchers call this a subscription trap, a well-documented dark pattern where sign-up is engineered to be effortless while cancellation is deliberately obstructed. A free trial that requires a credit card up front, with a vague reminder before charges begin, isn't a customer convenience. It's designed to convert inattentive trial users into paying subscribers automatically. A cancellation flow buried under several confirmation screens, phone calls, or account settings menus isn't thoroughness. It's deliberate friction, specifically placed at the one moment a company doesn't want you to succeed easily. A reminder email about an upcoming charge that arrives too close to the actual billing date to reasonably cancel in time isn't an oversight. It's timed deliberately to functionally auto-enroll inattentive users. This works because the asymmetry between easy sign-up and difficult cancellation reliably converts a portion of trial users into paying customers purely through inertia and friction, not genuine satisfaction. This sounds like simply standard subscription business practice, which many legitimate services do use responsibly. But real fairness would make cancellation exactly as easy as sign-up. Notice how many more steps it takes to leave than it took to join. A trial that's hard to escape was never really free. It was a hook, wearing a discount smile. You reach the final page expecting to confirm your order, and suddenly there's an extra fee, a pre-checked add-on, or a subscription box you never actually agreed to. User experience researchers call these dark patterns, deliberate interface designs that exploit inattention to add costs or commitments a shopper never consciously chose. A checkout page with an insurance, warranty, or membership option pre-selected by default isn't a helpful suggestion. It's designed so the inattentive majority accept it without noticing. A shipping or service fee that only appears at the very final confirmation step isn't a late disclosure oversight. It's deliberately delayed because early disclosure would reduce completed purchases. A button labeled ambiguously, so declining an add-on requires reading fine print rather than simply clicking "No thanks," isn't accidental wording. It's specifically designed to increase accidental opt-ins. This works because most people move through a familiar-feeling checkout flow on partial attention, and dark patterns are specifically engineered to exploit exactly that inattention. This sounds like simply a standard, if slightly annoying, checkout process, the kind everyone has experienced, but real transparency wouldn't need to hide costs until the very last possible moment. Notice how many extra charges or opt-ins you've accidentally accepted simply by not reading every single line carefully. A checkout that hides its true cost until the end was never really transparent. It was designed to bank on your inattention. The post reads like a personal, spontaneous thought until the product mentioned in passing turns out to be exactly what the caption is quietly promoting. Advertising researchers call this native advertising, content deliberately structured to feel organic specifically so it bypasses the skepticism a traditional ad would trigger. A post that casually mentions a product in the middle of an emotional personal story isn't coincidental context. It's a structure proven to lower resistance by disguising a pitch as a diary entry. A disclosure tag placed in tiny text at the very end of a long caption isn't accidental placement. It's compliance technically met, while the actual influence remains functionally hidden. An influencer suddenly, enthusiastically promoting a product entirely outside their usual content niche isn't following a new passion, they're following a paid partnership. This works because people trust individuals more than they trust brands, and advertisers have learned to route persuasion through borrowed personal trust rather than a direct pitch. This sounds like a genuine recommendation from someone you follow, and sometimes it partially is. But a real recommendation doesn't usually require a disclosure buried where it's least likely to be read. Notice if the personal story always seems to end at a product link. Content that feels spontaneous but sells something was never really spontaneous. It was scripted to feel that way. The commercial plays a song from your childhood, uses colors and fonts from decades ago, and somehow you feel a warm pull toward a product that has nothing to do with your actual memories. Marketing researchers call this nostalgia marketing, deliberately triggering warm, sentimental associations to transfer that positive feeling onto an unrelated, modern product. An ad that reintroduces an old jingle, mascot, or packaging design isn't simply celebrating brand history, it's borrowing decades of accumulated emotional trust to sell a current, possibly unrelated product. A campaign built entirely around "remember when" imagery, with minimal actual product information, isn't focused on informing you, it's relying on sentiment to do the persuading that facts alone might not achieve. A limited retro release priced significantly higher than the standard product isn't reflecting increased cost, it's monetizing the specific emotional pull of nostalgia itself. This works because nostalgic feelings are genuinely pleasant, and the brain doesn't naturally separate that pleasant feeling from the unrelated product being marketed alongside it. This sounds like simply a fun, sentimental campaign, which can genuinely be enjoyable. But real enjoyment of nostalgia doesn't require transferring that warmth uncritically onto a purchase decision. Notice how much of your interest in the product is really about the memory rather than the product's actual current merits. Warmth borrowed from your own memories was never actually coming from the product. It was borrowed and sold back to you. The label promises credibility, as seen on TV, featured in, as if simply appearing somewhere automatically proves quality, even though appearing often just means the company paid for airtime or placement. Marketing researchers describe this as borrowed authority, using the appearance of endorsement or exposure to imply a credibility the product hasn't independently demonstrated. A phrase like, "as seen on TV," isn't evidence of a product review or recommendation. In most cases, it simply means the company purchased advertising time, nothing more. A "featured in" claim referencing a well-known publication isn't necessarily a genuine, favorable review. It can simply mean the product appeared in a paid placement or a brief, unremarkable mention. A badge or seal on packaging resembling an official endorsement isn't always a verified certification. Some are simply self-created graphics designed to look official without any actual third-party evaluation behind them. This works because humans use apparent third-party validation as an efficient trust shortcut, one advertisers have learned to simulate convincingly without needing to earn it. This sounds like simply legitimate media coverage, which some products genuinely do receive, but real coverage usually comes with a specific, verifiable, and findable source rather than a vague blanket claim. Notice if you can actually locate the specific television segment or article being referenced. Authority claimed but never sourced was never really earned. It was borrowed from a claim with no actual origin. The label says limited edition, and somehow this exact limited version has been continuously available, in the same design, for well over a year. Marketing researchers call this manufactured scarcity, applying scarcity language to products with no actual production constraint, purely to increase perceived value and urgency. A limited edition release that gets reissued repeatedly under slightly different names isn't a genuine one-time production run. It's a recurring marketing label applied indefinitely. A company that never actually discontinues its limited product isn't managing constrained inventory. The limitation exists only in the wording, not in any actual supply chain reality. A collectible marketed as rare that remains easily purchasable months or years later isn't rare in any meaningful sense. It's using rarity language as a permanent feature of ordinary retail. This works because genuine scarcity does increase perceived value, so applying scarcity language, even falsely, reliably triggers the same psychological response as the real thing. This sounds like simply a special or exclusive release, something companies genuinely do offer sometimes. But real exclusivity usually has a verifiable, enforced production limit behind it. Notice if the limited product is still readily available whenever you check back later. Scarcity that never actually runs out was never scarcity at all. It was a label applied to an ordinary product. One specific item is priced so low it barely makes sense, and somehow that's exactly the reason you walked into the store or opened the app in the first place. Retail researchers call this a loss leader strategy, pricing a single item below cost specifically to attract customers who then spend more on other, higher-margin products. A retailer advertising one dramatically discounted item isn't losing money carelessly. It's deliberately absorbing that loss because the traffic it generates typically produces far more revenue elsewhere in the same visit. A store layout that places the loss leader item at the back, past aisles of full-priced products, isn't a random floor plan. It's specifically designed to maximize your exposure to everything else before you reach the deal that brought you in. An online sale advertised prominently for one product, while related items in the same cart remain full price, isn't coincidental bundling. It's a deliberate strategy to recover the loss through your additional purchases. This works because the initial excellent deal creates goodwill and momentum that carries into the rest of the shopping trip, often outweighing the actual savings from the original discount. This sounds like simply a genuinely good sale, and on that one item, it usually is. But the overall trip is rarely designed to save you money once every purchase is considered together. Notice how much you ended up spending beyond the one deal that brought you in. A deal that draws you in was never really about that one item. It was about everything you'd buy once you arrived. The ad doesn't really describe the product at all. It just shows crowds of people, laughing, thriving, all somehow already using it, as if joining them were the entire point. Marketing researchers call this bandwagon advertising, relying on the implication of widespread popularity to persuade rather than any actual information about the product's qualities. A campaign built entirely around phrases like, "everyone's switching to," or "join millions who already," isn't providing evidence. It's using implied consensus as a substitute for an actual argument. An ad showing crowds enjoying a product with minimal focus on its specific features or benefits isn't information light by accident. The social proof itself is the entire persuasive strategy. A claim of overwhelming popularity with no specific, verifiable numbers attached isn't a factual statement. It's a vague impression deliberately engineered to feel like consensus without actually providing any. This works because humans use the popularity of a choice as a rough proxy for its quality, a shortcut that bandwagon advertising exploits directly instead of earning through genuine merit. This sounds like simply showing satisfied customers, something legitimate testimonials genuinely do, but real testimonials usually include some specific detail rather than just an implied crowd. Notice if the ad could actually tell you anything concrete about the product beyond how many people supposedly use it. An ad that sells you a crowd was never really selling you a product. It was selling you the fear of being the one left out of it. The customer quote reads suspiciously like ad copy, polished, specific about the exact features the company wants highlighted, in a way real customers rarely phrase things naturally. Marketing researchers note that a significant portion of testimonials in advertising are either written by copywriters and lightly attributed, or solicited from customers with financial incentive attached. A testimonial that uses marketing language, game-changing, revolutionary, rather than the more casual, specific phrasing real customers typically use, isn't a coincidence of enthusiasm. It's often written or heavily edited by the company itself. A testimonial attributed only to a first name and last initial, with no verifiable identity or photo, isn't standard privacy protection. It's frequently a sign the quote can't actually be traced back to a real, confirmed customer. A testimonial that highlights precisely the features the company most needs to sell, in suspiciously perfect proportion, isn't organic customer feedback. It's built to hit specific, persuasive talking points a real review rarely covers so neatly. This works because a testimonial feels like independent verification, bypassing the skepticism a direct company claim would normally trigger. This sounds like simply a satisfied customer sharing their experience, which some genuinely are. But real customer language is usually messier, more specific to their actual situation, and less perfectly aligned with the sales pitch. Notice if the testimonial reads more like copy than like a person. A quote that sounds written rather than spoken was never really given. It was composed. You're reading an article, informative, balanced in tone, right up until you notice, tucked in small gray text, The word sponsored, you almost scrolled past entirely. Media researchers call this native advertising. Content formatted to closely resemble genuine editorial material, specifically so it bypasses the skepticism a labeled ad would trigger. An article that reads like objective journalism, but consistently favors one specific brand or product throughout, isn't unbiased reporting. It's sponsored content designed to mimic the credibility of the outlet's actual editorial work. A sponsored or partner content label rendered in small, low-contrast text isn't standard disclosure practice. It's technically compliant while remaining functionally easy to overlook. A publication that runs sponsored articles in the same visual format as its regular journalism isn't being efficient with design. It's deliberately blurring the lines so readers extend the same trust to both. This works because people extend far more credibility to editorial content than to obvious advertising, and native ads are specifically built to borrow that trust without earning it independently. This sounds like simply a modern advertising format, and legally, disclosed native ads are permitted, but real transparency wouldn't need the label to be quite this easy to miss. Notice how much attention you actually paid to the sponsorship disclosure before you started reading. Content designed to look like journalism was never quite journalism. It was an ad, wearing an article's byline. You looked at one product once, briefly, out of passing curiosity, and now it follows you across every app, every website, every scroll for weeks afterward. Digital marketing researchers call this retargeting, a deliberate advertising strategy that uses tracking data to repeatedly serve ads for something you've merely viewed, not necessarily wanted. An ad that appears again and again across unrelated platforms isn't a coincidence of broad advertising. It's a specifically triggered campaign following your individual browsing history. A product that seems to know you looked at it once isn't reading your mind. It's the result of tracking pixels and cookies designed specifically to retarget based on your own recorded behavior. A retargeted ad that offers a slightly better price than your original visit isn't a reward for loyalty. It's a calculated incentive designed specifically to convert lingering interest into an actual purchase. This works because repeated exposure alone increases familiarity and perceived trust, converting a fleeting glance into sustained pressure through sheer persistence rather than any new information. This sounds like simply relevant, personalized advertising, which platforms frame exactly that way. But real relevance doesn't require this much repeated, tracked pursuit across every corner of your digital life. Notice how long a single product keeps reappearing after your original brief interest has already faded. An ad that won't stop following you was never simply informing you, it was pursuing you, until persistence did what the pitch alone couldn't. The price reads $19.99, and somehow it registers as meaningfully cheaper than $20. Even though the actual difference is a single cent. Behavioral economists call this psychological or charm pricing, exploiting the brain's tendency to process the leftmost digit of a price as disproportionately significant. A price ending in .99 isn't simply precise accounting, it's a well-documented technique specifically chosen because the brain rounds down to the nearest whole number faster than it rounds up. A retailer that consistently prices everything just below a round number isn't reflecting genuine cost calculations. It's applying a pricing convention proven to make items feel like a better deal than they mathematically are. A sale that reduces a price from $50.00 to $49.99 isn't a meaningful discount. It's a psychological nudge disguised as one. This works because the brain processes numbers from left to right, giving outsized weight to the first digit and underweighting the small remaining difference. This sounds like simply standard, ordinary pricing, the kind used almost everywhere, and it largely is. But recognizing the trick means you can evaluate the actual price rather than the impression it's engineered to create. Notice if you'd feel meaningfully different about a price rounded up by 1 cent. A price built to feel cheaper than it is was never really about the cost. It was about the impression the number makes before you've done the math. The offer promises a free gift with purchase, and somehow, to qualify, you end up spending significantly more than you originally planned to buy. Marketing researchers describe this as a gift with purchase threshold, a technique that uses the appeal of something free to increase overall spending well beyond the value of the gift itself. A minimum spend required to unlock a small free item isn't simply a loyalty reward. It's calculated specifically so the additional required spending exceeds the actual value of what's given away. A free add-on bundled with an already inflated product price isn't a genuine bonus. Its cost has frequently already been built quietly into the price you're paying regardless. A promotion that requires buying multiple items to earn one free product isn't rewarding your loyalty. It's engineered so the incremental spend required outweighs the value of the incentive dangled in front of you. This works because free is one of the most powerful words in marketing, capable of overriding an otherwise rational evaluation of the actual math involved. This sounds like simply a generous promotional offer, which some genuinely are, if the math works in your favor, but real generosity doesn't usually require spending well beyond your original need to receive it. Notice how much more you spent to qualify compared to what the free item is actually worth. A gift that costs more than it saves was never really free. It was a spending threshold, wearing a bow. The ad shows the most heartbreaking image it can find, paired with a donation ask specifically timed to arrive while that image is still fresh in your mind. Marketing researchers describe this as guilt-based fundraising, using emotionally overwhelming imagery to trigger a donation decision before it can be evaluated calmly. A campaign that leads with graphic suffering rather than transparent information about how funds are actually used isn't prioritizing honesty. It's prioritizing the emotional reaction most likely to generate an immediate donation. A charity ad that implies your inaction directly causes ongoing harm isn't simply raising awareness. It's specifically assigning personal guilt to increase the pressure to give right now. A donation ask that provides no clear breakdown of where the money actually goes isn't an oversight. Vague framing keeps the emotional appeal front and center instead of inviting the kind of scrutiny transparency would require. This works because guilt and emotional overwhelm reliably produce faster giving decisions than a calm, informed evaluation of an organization's actual effectiveness would. This sounds like simply raising awareness for a genuine cause, and many charitable causes are entirely legitimate. But real transparency doesn't require manufactured guilt to make its case. Notice if you can actually find a clear account of how your donation would be used before you give. A donation ask built entirely on guilt was never really about the cause. It was about the feeling, engineered to move you before you'd checked. The before photo is dim, unflattering, poorly lit, and the after photo is bright, confident, professionally shot, and somehow the product is credited with the entire visible difference. Advertising researchers describe this as deceptive before and after staging, manipulating lighting, posture, and presentation to exaggerate a product's actual effect. A before image, shot with harsh lighting and a slouched posture, compared to an after image with flattering light and a confident pose, isn't a fair before and after comparison. It's two different photographic conditions being credited entirely to the product. A transformation photo with no consistent camera angle, distance, or background between the two shots isn't a documentation error. It's a common technique that exaggerates change well beyond what the product itself achieved. A result presented as typical, without disclosing it as an unusual best-case outcome, isn't representative marketing. It's cherry-picked evidence framed as an ordinary expectation. This works because visual proof feels more convincing than a written claim, even when the visual conditions themselves have been deliberately manipulated to support the desired conclusion. This sounds like simply a compelling product demonstration, something legitimate results-based marketing genuinely uses, but real demonstration doesn't require manipulating lighting and posture to manufacture the illusion of dramatic change. Notice if the before and after photos were actually taken under comparable conditions. A transformation staged this differently was never really documenting the product's effect. It was documenting the photography. The label says natural, clean, or wholesome, and somehow that single word makes the product feel healthier before you've actually read a single ingredient. Marketing researchers call this the health halo effect, where a vague positive term causes people to assume broader health benefits the product hasn't actually demonstrated. A product labeled natural isn't legally required to meet any specific nutritional standard in most cases. The word itself carries no guaranteed health benefit despite its powerful positive impression. A snack marketed as made with real fruit can still contain minimal actual fruit alongside substantial added sugar. The phrase highlights one true detail while obscuring the fuller nutritional picture. A product using earthy colors, leaf imagery, and rustic fonts on its packaging isn't providing nutritional information. It's using visual design specifically to imply health benefits the actual label may not support. This works because a single positive-sounding cue can create a broad halo of assumed health benefits that a person doesn't feel the need to verify by actually checking the nutrition facts. This sounds like simply appealing to health-conscious consumers, a legitimate goal many products genuinely pursue, but real health claims should be specific and verifiable, rather than implied through packaging and vague adjectives. Notice how differently the product feels once you actually read the full ingredient list rather than just the front label. A health claim that's only a feeling was never actually a health claim. It was packaging, dressed as evidence. You've seen this exact "flash sale ending soon" banner on this website for months now. Always urgent, always about to end, yet somehow never actually gone. Marketing researchers describe this as a perpetual urgency loop, a deliberate strategy where sales are framed as temporary and urgent, despite functioning as an essentially permanent pricing structure. A flash sale that reappears under a new countdown every single week isn't a genuine limited event. It's a manufactured urgency cycle applied to what is functionally an everyday price. A retailer whose sale price has been active continuously for months isn't running a real promotion. The discounted price simply is the actual price, dressed in urgent, temporary-sounding language. A countdown clock that restarts automatically once it reaches zero isn't a coding error. It's specifically designed to maintain the psychological pressure of urgency indefinitely, regardless of any real deadline. This works because a sense of expiring urgency reliably produces faster purchasing decisions than a calm, ordinary price ever would, even when the expiration never actually arrives. This sounds like simply a recurring seasonal promotion, something legitimate retailers genuinely run periodically, but real recurring sales usually have actual gaps between them, not a countdown that resets the instant it reaches zero. Notice how long this specific urgent sale has actually been running uninterrupted. A sale that never really ends was never really urgent. It was constant, wearing urgency's mask. You came in for one specific thing, and somehow you're leaving with the extended warranty, the premium package, and a second item you hadn't even considered, all presented as if declining would be the unusual choice. Sales researchers describe this as an upsell script, a structured technique that frames additional purchases as the sensible default rather than an optional add-on. A salesperson who presents the upgraded option first, before mentioning the basic version at all, isn't simply informing you of the range, they're anchoring your expectation toward the higher-priced choice from the very start. A phrase like, "most people also get," isn't neutral information about typical customer behavior. It's a scripted nudge specifically designed to make the additional purchase feel like the reasonable norm rather than an upsell. A checkout flow that requires you to actively decline an add-on rather than actively choose it isn't a neutral default. It's structured so accepting requires the least effort and declining requires the most. This works because a suggestion framed as the default choice reduces the friction of actively saying no, which most people find socially and cognitively easier to avoid. This sounds like simply helpful product guidance from an attentive salesperson, and sometimes upselling does genuinely serve your actual needs, but real guidance doesn't require framing extra spending as the default rather than the exception. Notice how much of what you bought today you would have specifically requested if no one had suggested it first. An upsell dressed as a favor was never really doing you one. It was doing the store one. A famous face appears beside the product, smiling, credible, trustworthy, and somehow that alone makes the product feel more legitimate, despite the celebrity likely having no actual expertise in what's being sold. Marketing researchers call this the halo effect of celebrity endorsement, transferring an audience's trust in a familiar public figure directly onto an unrelated product or claim. A celebrity promoting a supplement, financial product, or skincare line isn't necessarily demonstrating personal expertise. In most cases, they're simply being compensated to lend their recognizable face to the campaign. An endorsement that emphasizes the celebrity's fame rather than any specific verifiable claim about the product isn't providing evidence. It's substituting recognizability for actual substantiation. A campaign that never discloses the payment or partnership clearly isn't an oversight in most regulated markets. It's a disclosure requirement met as minimally and quietly as legally possible. This works because familiarity and likability transfer easily from a trusted face to an unrelated product, a bias advertisers have learned to exploit deliberately and reliably. This sounds like simply a public figure sharing something they genuinely enjoy, which occasionally is true. But real recommendation doesn't require a disclosed payment to explain the sudden, enthusiastic endorsement. Notice if the celebrity has any actual, relevant expertise in what they're promoting. Trust borrowed from a familiar face was never actually evidence about the product. It was borrowed and priced into the campaign. You walked in for one thing, and somehow the lighting, the music, the specific scent in the air made you linger, browse, and spend more than you'd planned. Retail researchers call this sensory marketing, deliberately engineering a store's atmosphere to influence mood and spending behavior below the level of conscious awareness. A store that pipes a specific pleasant scent through its ventilation isn't simply making the space smell nice. Certain scents are specifically chosen because research shows they increase time spent and money spent in retail environments. Background music at a slower tempo in a store isn't a random playlist choice. Slower music has been shown to measurably reduce the pace of shopping, giving customers more time to be exposed to products. Lighting designed to be warm, soft, and flattering, rather than bright and clinical, isn't simply an aesthetic decision. It's calibrated specifically to put customers in a relaxed, positive state more conducive to spending. This works because ambient sensory cues influence mood and behavior without requiring any conscious evaluation, making the manipulation far harder to notice than a direct sales pitch would be. This sounds like simply a pleasant, well-designed shopping environment, which stores genuinely do want to create. But real pleasantness doesn't usually double as a precisely engineered behavioral tool. Notice how much longer you tend to linger in stores with unusually pleasant lighting, scent, or music. An atmosphere built to feel effortless was never accidental. It was engineered, one sense at a time. The chart shows their product outperforming every competitor across every category, and somehow every single measurement conveniently favors the company that made the chart. Advertising researchers describe this as a rigged comparison, selectively choosing metrics, competitors, or conditions specifically designed to guarantee a favorable outcome. A comparison chart that only tests categories where the advertised product happens to excel isn't a comprehensive evaluation. It's cherry-picked criteria engineered specifically to produce a predetermined winner. An ad that compares its premium product against a competitor's basic, entry-level model isn't a fair, equivalent comparison. It's deliberately mismatched to guarantee favorable results. A claim of superiority with no cited source, methodology, or independent testing isn't verifiable evidence. It's simply an assertion dressed up in the visual language of data. This works because a chart or graph carries an implied authority and objectivity that a person doesn't always pause to verify, especially when it confirms what the advertiser wants you to believe. This sounds like simply informative comparative advertising, something legitimate testing organizations do provide, but real comparisons disclose their methodology and don't consistently favor only the party that funded the study. Notice if you can actually find the underlying methodology behind a comparison claim before accepting it. A comparison that wins on every metric, every time, was never really objective. It was designed, specifically, to win. The label says, "Doctor recommended," and somehow that single phrase makes the product feel medically validated, despite no specific doctor, study, or number ever actually being named. Marketing researchers describe this as vague authority marketing, using an unspecified professional endorsement to imply credibility without providing any verifiable specifics. A claim of "doctor recommended," with no named physician, no cited study, and no specific number of doctors surveyed isn't a factual medical endorsement. It's a vague phrase engineered to sound authoritative while remaining functionally unverifiable. A product that says "recommended by professionals" without specifying which professionals, in what field, or under what circumstances, isn't providing evidence. It's borrowing the feeling of expert consensus without the substance of it. A claim that 9 out of 10 dentists recommend, without disclosing the survey size, methodology, or actual question asked, isn't meaningful statistical evidence. It's a number engineered to sound rigorous while revealing almost nothing verifiable. This works because an appeal to unnamed expert authority satisfies the brain's desire for credible validation without requiring the effort of actually checking whether that validation exists in any specific, checkable form. This sounds like simply legitimate professional endorsement, which some products do genuinely have, with real, named studies behind them. But real endorsement is specific, sourced, and checkable rather than vague and reassuring. Notice if you can actually find the specific doctor's, study, or survey behind the claim. An endorsement with no name behind it was never really an endorsement. It was a phrase, borrowed from the idea of one. You keep shopping at the same store, even when a better price exists elsewhere, purely because you don't want to lose the points, the tier status, the perks you've slowly built up. Behavioral economists describe this as a loyalty lock-in, a program specifically designed to leverage loss aversion, making customers stay not out of genuine preference, but out of reluctance to lose accumulated status. A point system that requires an unusually high threshold before any reward becomes meaningfully usable isn't rewarding your loyalty efficiently. It's designed to keep your accumulated value just out of reach, encouraging continued spending to finally cash in. A tier status that resets if you don't spend enough within a set period isn't tracking genuine loyalty accurately. It's manufacturing an artificial deadline that pressures continued purchasing purely to avoid losing status. A program that makes leaving feel like forfeiting real, accumulated value isn't simply rewarding good customers. It's specifically engineered so switching to a competitor feels like a loss, rather than simply a neutral choice. This works because the psychological pain of losing accumulated points or status frequently outweighs the actual calculated financial benefit those points provide. This sounds like simply a rewards program benefiting loyal customers, which some genuinely do provide real value. But real value shouldn't require this much engineered fear of loss just to keep you coming back. Notice if you've ever chosen a worse deal purely to avoid losing loyalty points elsewhere. A program that punishes leaving was never really about rewarding you. It was about keeping you, dressed up as a reward. The ad shows other people already enjoying the experience, the event, the product, and somehow the thought of being the one left out feels worse than the cost of actually buying in. Marketing researchers describe this as fear of missing out advertising, deliberately manufacturing social exclusion anxiety to accelerate a purchasing decision beyond what careful consideration would produce. A campaign emphasizing, "Don't be the last one," or "Everyone's already there," isn't providing product information, it's activating social anxiety as the primary persuasive mechanism instead of any actual argument for the purchase. An event or product marketed with heavy emphasis on other attendees' excitement, rather than details about the experience itself, isn't informing your decision. It's substituting social pressure for substance. A limited registration window paired with visible images of a filling, popular event isn't neutral information. It's specifically combining scarcity and social proof to maximize the urgency of a rushed decision. This works because social exclusion registers as a genuine, uncomfortable threat, one that reliably overrides a calmer, more deliberate evaluation of whether the purchase actually serves you. This sounds like simply exciting, in-demand experiences worth knowing about, and some genuinely are worth the excitement. But real interest doesn't usually require manufactured anxiety about being excluded to make its case. Notice if you can actually articulate why you want the product itself, separate from the fear of missing it. Excitement built on exclusion anxiety was never really about the experience. It was about the fear of not being included in it. The ad targets a specific worry, precisely, uncomfortably precisely, in a way that feels like it was written just for you, because in a very real sense, it was. Digital marketing researchers describe this as psychographic targeting, using behavioral and demographic data to identify and directly target a person's specific emotional vulnerabilities. An ad that appears immediately after you've searched for something related to a personal struggle isn't a coincidence. It's the direct result of tracking systems specifically designed to connect your search behavior to targeted emotional messaging. A campaign that seems to understand your specific financial, health, or relationship anxieties in unsettling detail isn't intuitive marketing. It's data-driven targeting built from a profile of your own recorded behavior across multiple platforms. An ad that shifts its messaging based on the time of day, location, or recent browsing history you've exhibited isn't a coincidence of good timing. It's a system specifically engineered to intercept you at your most emotionally vulnerable, trackable moment. This works because a message that feels uncannily personal bypasses the generic skepticism a broad advertisement would normally trigger, precisely because it doesn't feel like advertising at all. This sounds like simply relevant, helpful advertising, the framing platforms consistently use. But real relevance doesn't require this much invisible profiling of your specific emotional vulnerabilities to achieve. Notice how precisely an ad seems to understand a worry you rarely say out loud. An ad that knows your insecurity this well was never simply informing you. It was targeting you, at the exact moment you were least offended. The advertised price got you in the door, excited, ready to buy. And now, somehow, that exact item is, unfortunately, sold out, with a more expensive alternative conveniently ready to take its place. Consumer protection researchers describe this as bait-and-switch advertising, a well-documented tactic where an attractive offer draws customers in specifically to redirect them toward a costlier alternative. A retailer that advertises heavily for an item with suspiciously limited actual stock isn't experiencing an honest shortage. In many cases, the advertised item was never intended to be the primary product sold. A salesperson who quickly pivots to a better alternative the moment you ask about the specifically advertised deal isn't offering a helpful upgrade. They're executing exactly the redirection the entire advertising strategy was built around. A company that accepts this just sold out pattern across multiple visits or campaigns isn't experiencing coincidental bad luck. It's running a consistent, deliberate strategy rather than a one-time inventory issue. This works because the initial attractive offer creates momentum and commitment toward making a purchase. Momentum that's then redirected toward a less advantageous but still completed sale. This sounds like simply unfortunate, ordinary stock shortages, which do genuinely happen sometimes, but a real shortage doesn't usually happen this consistently every single time you specifically ask about that exact advertised deal. Notice if the advertised deal is ever actually available when you go looking for it. An offer that's never actually available was never really the offer. It was the bait, and you were always meant to meet the switch. Signing up took a single click, but canceling requires a phone call, a hold time, and a retention agent whose entire job is to talk you out of leaving. Consumer researchers describe this asymmetry as a well-documented dark pattern, deliberately making cancellation more effortful than sign-up to reduce the number of customers who successfully leave. A service that allows instant online sign-up but requires phone-only cancellation isn't a technical limitation, it's a deliberate choice. Because phone cancellation reliably produces higher retention through friction and live persuasion. A cancellation page that requires navigating through multiple confirmation screens, each offering a discount to stay, isn't customer care. It's a scripted retention funnel specifically designed to intercept your decision at every possible point. A retention agent trained to offer discounts, pause options, or guilt-based appeals only once you've explicitly stated you want to cancel isn't naturally persuasive. They're following a structured script engineered specifically for this exact moment of vulnerability. This works because friction and personal interaction both reliably reduce the number of people who follow through on canceling, even when their original intention was completely clear. This sounds like simply a company trying to retain valued customers, which is a reasonable business goal in principle, but real retention should come from genuine satisfaction, not from making the exit deliberately harder to find. Notice how many more steps cancellation requires compared to how few steps sign-up took. A service this hard to leave was never confident in its own value. It was relying on friction instead. The packaging is green, earthy, covered in leaf icons and words like eco-conscious, and somehow that visual language alone convinces you the product is meaningfully better for the environment. Environmental researchers call this greenwashing, using environmental-sounding language and imagery without any substantive, verifiable environmental improvement behind it. A product labeled eco-friendly with no specific, measurable claim about its actual environmental impact isn't providing verifiable information. It's using a feeling of environmental virtue as a substitute for any real, checkable data. A company that highlights one minor sustainable practice while remaining silent about far larger environmental impacts elsewhere in its operations isn't being transparent. It's spotlighting a single detail specifically to distract from the fuller picture. A certification-style badge that isn't actually issued by any recognized independent environmental body isn't a verified credential. It's frequently a self-created graphic designed to resemble one. This works because consumers increasingly want to make environmentally responsible choices, and a symbolic gesture toward sustainability satisfies that desire without requiring the company to make the more difficult, costly changes actual sustainability would demand. This sounds like simply a company trying to be more environmentally conscious, which legitimate sustainability efforts genuinely reflect. But real environmental claims are specific, measurable, and usually backed by independent verifiable certification. Notice if the eco-friendly claim is backed by any specific checkable standard or simply by green packaging and reassuring words. An environmental claim with no specifics behind it was never really about the environment. It was about the feeling the packaging was designed to create. The creator seems genuinely, spontaneously excited, opening the box on camera as if discovering the product for the very first time, right up until you notice they've done this exact format for a dozen other brands this month alone. Marketing researchers describe this as sponsored content dressed as organic discovery, a format specifically designed to simulate authentic, unscripted enthusiasm. A creator whose unboxing reaction seems suspiciously polished and rehearsed for something supposedly seen for the first time isn't naturally spontaneous. In many cases, the entire segment has been scripted, rehearsed, or filmed multiple times before the final cut. A video that never mentions the video is sponsored until a small disclosure appears briefly, buried in the description, or a quick verbal mention isn't accidental omission. It's compliance met as minimally as legally required, while the persuasive experience remains functionally undisclosed. A creator who consistently reacts with identical enthusiasm, regardless of the product's actual category or quality, isn't demonstrating genuine, product-specific excitement. They're delivering a consistent performance regardless of the product underneath it. This works because an unscripted feeling reaction bypasses the skepticism a direct advertisement would trigger, borrowing the creator's perceived authenticity to sell a product they may have received for free specifically for this purpose. This sounds like simply a creator sharing genuine excitement about a new product, which occasionally is true, but real spontaneous excitement doesn't usually repeat itself this identically across dozens of different unrelated products. Notice how consistently enthusiastic the reaction is, regardless of which specific product is being unboxed. Excitement that repeats this identically was never really spontaneous. It was a format, rehearsed to look like a surprise. The tag reads, "Compare at $120, beside a current price of $60, and somehow that comparison alone makes the lower price feel like an obvious, generous bargain." Consumer protection researchers describe this as an inflated reference price, a well-documented tactic where the compare at figure was never actually charged by any real retailer, existing purely to make the current price look more attractive by comparison. A compare at price with no specific retailer or product listing cited isn't a verifiable market comparison. It's frequently an arbitrary number chosen specifically to maximize the appearance of savings. A discount store whose original prices consistently exceed what the same or similar items sell for elsewhere isn't reflecting an honest market value. It's manufacturing the exact anchor a real discount would otherwise require. A retailer that uses this inflated comparison consistently across its entire product line isn't making an occasional pricing error. It's applying a systematic strategy specifically designed to make ordinary prices feel like exceptional deals. This works because the brain judges value relative to a nearby reference number, and a fabricated anchor can make almost any price feel like a bargain by comparison alone. This sounds like simply a genuine discount off a real market price, which legitimate sales certainly do offer. But real value doesn't depend on a fictional, unverifiable comparison price to feel worthwhile. Notice if you can find the compare at price actually charged anywhere else. A discount measured against a fabricated number was never really a discount. It was a comparison, engineered specifically to move you. The sample was small, free, unsolicited, and somehow afterward you felt a genuine, if slightly irrational pull to actually buy the full product, as if you owed it something in return. Behavioral scientists call this reciprocity marketing, deliberately giving something small for free, specifically to trigger the deep social instinct to return the favor. A free sample offered without any request in return isn't simply generous marketing. It's a calculated investment specifically because reciprocity reliably converts a portion of recipients into paying customers. A company that offers a free trial period, sample, or introductory gift isn't just building goodwill. It's exploiting a well-documented psychological principle that receiving something creates an felt obligation to reciprocate, even when no explicit request was ever made. A salesperson who offers a small, unsolicited favor before making their actual pitch isn't simply being kind. They're activating the same reciprocity instinct in a more personal, one-on-one context. This works because the discomfort of feeling indebted, even for something small and freely given, is often enough to tip an otherwise uncertain purchasing decision toward yes. This sounds like simply generous, low-pressure marketing, which in isolation it genuinely can be. But real generosity doesn't typically function as a calculated investment in your future obligation to buy. Notice if your interest in purchasing increased specifically after receiving something free, rather than from the product's own merits. A sample that creates obligation was never really a gift. It was the first move, in a favor you never actually asked to owe. Somehow, defending a brand you don't own any part of has started to feel personal. Almost like defending a version of your own identity rather than simply a product you happen to buy. Marketing researchers describe this as brand tribalism, deliberately cultivating a sense of in-group identity around a product so loyalty feels like belonging rather than simply preference. A brand that positions itself in explicit opposition to a rival, encouraging customers to identify against the competing brand's users, isn't simply marketing a product. It's manufacturing an identity conflict that makes switching feel like betrayal rather than a neutral choice. A campaign that frames using the product as a statement about who you are rather than simply what it does isn't offering functional information. It's selling identity and belonging as the actual product. A customer who feels genuinely defensive or insulted by criticism of a brand they have no financial stake in isn't reacting to a personal attack. They've internalized brand loyalty as a component of their own identity, exactly as the marketing intended. This works because identity-based loyalty is far more durable and resistant to competitive pricing than loyalty based purely on product features or cost. This sounds like simply having a genuine preference for a product you like, which is completely reasonable. But real preference doesn't usually require treating a rival's customers as an opposing tribe. Notice how personally you take criticism of a brand you don't actually have a financial stake in. Loyalty that feels like identity was never really about the product. It was about belonging, sold to you as a preference. Something small triggers it, a mirror, a comment, an ordinary moment, and suddenly you're aware of a flaw you now take completely for granted as something that's simply always been wrong with you. Marketing researchers describe this as normalized manufactured insecurity. A worry originally introduced by advertising that has since become fully absorbed into a person's own sense of self, indistinguishable from an organic concern. A standard of appearance, health, or success that feels like simply common sense may not be a neutral, universal truth at all. It's frequently the residue of decades of advertising specifically designed to introduce exactly that standard as a baseline expectation. A worry that felt deeply personal for years isn't necessarily an original self-generated concern. It's often the lingering effect of a message absorbed so long ago and so repeatedly that it stopped feeling like it came from anywhere external at all. A comparison you make about your own body, home, or life that seems entirely your own idea may actually trace back to a specific advertising campaign that first suggested exactly that comparison mattered. This clarity arrives late because effective advertising is specifically designed to feel like your own independent thought rather than an external message, precisely so it never has to justify itself as constructed. This sounds like simply having your own personal standards and preferences, and in part it is, but real self-understanding doesn't require excusing an insecurity now that you can actually trace where it came from. Notice how obvious the manufactured origin looks the moment you stop calling it your own idea. An insecurity seen clearly for the first time was never really yours. It was sold to you, so gradually it started to feel like it always had been.